So the FDA is part of the Department of Health and Human Services, which is the big umbrella part of the government. So they have lots of divisions, but the FDA is just one of those. So the FDA is also broken up into several different divisions. What we're going to focus on is CBER, the Center for Biologic Evaluation and Research. So if I say the FDA, I'm talking about CBER, which is just the division under the FDA that regulates blood, tissues, those type of things. So, of course, CBER has a mission statement like other companies or government agencies. They generally always have a mission statement. But the FDA tries to ensure that the potency of the blood products is appropriate with 5 layers of safety. So they look at donor screening. They have standards for donor screening. Deferral lists are very important. Blood testing, quarantine, and then problem reporting and resolution, which we'll cover a little bit more later on. So why does the FDA get to interact with all blood services, transfusion services? So it's a federal laws set up the framework for this. So first one was the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, and then you have the Public Health Services Act, and then you also have regulations that support the acts. So you have a law, and then you have the regulations that tell you how to implement the law, and then you have guidance documents from the FDA that they publish, which is their current thinking on any given situation. So how they interpret the law. So guidance documents are non-binding. So that means, unlike the laws and regulations, you do not have to follow them, but you better have a very good reason not to, if you decide not to follow a guidance document. So like many other things in the government, something bad happens, then they regulate, have a new law. Something bad happens, they change it. So these are just some examples. First, in 1906, the jungle was published. So they started regulating the meat packing industry, that kind of thing. And then in 1938, Congress passed the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, requiring all new drugs and related products to be proven for safety before you issue them. And that was basically the result of an incident where some medication marketed specifically to children was made with ethylene glycol, and 134 children died, and there was no way to trace where it went. So they couldn't recall it or no, please don't use this medication, because they had no idea where it was sold or who had it. So there was no control. So just some more dates of bad things that we've done in our past. Syphilis studies in '72, HIV crisis in the '80s, and all of these things Congress kind of acts on. So the biggest thing is that you'll hear a lot is CLIA 88. Have you guys ever heard of that? So those were the Clinical Laboratory Improvement Amendments passed in 1988. They were also amended in 2003, but those are the basis for CAP regulations and most clinical laboratory regulations. So the Code of Federal Regulations is where you can find all of these laws and regulations. So if someone says the code, they're referring to the CFR, or the Code of Federal Regulations. So it's a combination of all of the rules, proposed rules of the federal government, and it gets published every day, and then it gets combined into bound chapters where you can, I don't think anybody probably buys the paper copies anymore, but you can, and they get updated every year. But you can search, there's a couple of different websites where you can find things online. And they're published by the Federal Register, National Archives, and Records Administration. So there's like a department that does this and puts this out every day. And you can sign up for emails if you want email notifications about certain things getting published into law. And it's all government, excuse me, all laws and regulations and executive orders are published in the register. So once they divide it up into the code, there are chapters, and then so titles, parts, subparts, and paragraphs. So if I say 21 CFR 606.2b, so it's Title 21, because there are different titles, there are 50 titles. CFR, Code of Federal Regulations, Part 606, Subpart 2, Point 2, and then Paragraph B. So the two websites at the bottom are the different websites where you can search for the Code of Federal Regulations. I prefer the FDA site, the one on the right. I think it's on your right. Because you can keyword search. The only issue with that is if you're not looking in the 21 CFR, which is where all the blood and biologic stuff is which I normally need to look at. The other site gives you all the different titles, so you could look at all the different titles. And I find it a little bit more cumbersome to find what I want, since I'm only ever looking in the 21 title. But the keyword search is pretty nice, because you can say, what about temperature? And then it'll bring up all the sections of the code that have issues with temperature. So there are 3 titles that are important to a clinical lab and for ARUP. So we have Title 21, which is food and drugs, and then we have Title 42, which is public health, and then Title 29, which is OSHA and safety. So Title 21 contains electronic records and signatures. As we become more, a lot of records are all kept electronically now. You have electronic signatures. There are regulations that you have to comply with to make sure that the records are indeed valid and that the signatures you have that are just done on the computer without a physical signature are appropriate. So those are found in Part 11. Part 51 is good laboratory practice and good, for lab studies, basically. Laboratory practices are not for humans, so if you're doing something in the laboratory for basic research, any kind of a cell model, any kind of animal model before you take to clinical trials, something like that, it'll be in the good laboratory practices section that'll govern those. 200s is drugs, which is important for us because the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act declared that a blood is both a pharmaceutical or a drug and a biologic. So we have to make sure that we comply with both of these regulations. So the 600s are biologics. 800s are medical devices. And you wouldn't necessarily think intuitively that, why do I care about a medical device? But a lot of the systems that you use in the laboratory are medical devices. So the instruments that you use as a medical device, computer systems can be classified as medical devices, specifically transfusion and blood services computer systems are always medical devices. So you have to make sure that if you're building something on your own, that you are complying with the 800 regulations, and if you're buying it from a vendor, that they meet all those regulations. And then the 1200s are tissue regulations. 42 contains CLIA, so important for all clinical laboratories because you have to follow CLIA. So the transfusion service has to follow CLIA and all the 21 regulations. And then Title 29, is the OSHA standards for safety in different workplaces, including laboratories.